And Benedict had a question, I think.
Yeah, final question.
Yes, I'd like to thank you very much for your speech. You're obviously a very brilliant politician.
Brilliant question, Benedict. Thank you very much.
And I especially like your point about having trade with the New Zealanders because they have common law with you and common practices, unlike the Europeans, I assume. But I thought that was what the European Union was about, but correct me if I'm wrong. But I think now, and I do agree with you, and we agree on one point, that is that we should pursue this and end with a democratic process, an election. I think that's absolutely necessary. And it goes one way or the other, and we'll have the people settle this. And I think up to then, I also agree with you that we should finish the process and try to get as good a deal as we can with good friends as you. And I think you'd probably be a better advisor than most people because you're a Eurosceptic and you'll point out the things that people who are pro-European would not point out to us. So that would be excellent. There's one more thing that I'd like to add because I watched your speech in the European Parliament the other day where you invoked the well-known book, Independent People, or Sjálfstætt Folk, as you so beautifully said in your speech. And I assume you're well aware of what it's about. It's about a farmer that wants to retain his independence, and he does that at all costs. And at the end of the book, he's walking back from the village up to a farm that has been left. During the book, he lost both of his wives. He lost his farm. He lost his livestock, and he's bringing his daughter, who's sick with tuberculosis, from the village to the farm. But he did retain his independence all the time.
Sure. Okay, let me deal with them in reverse order. First of all, I think it's the European Union is in the position of the declining farmer rather than Iceland. I mean, over my lifetime, Iceland has been growing. And it's the EU that has been shrinking. And by the way, there's a reason why that happens. It's not because Europeans are sort of lazier than, well, obviously some of them are by the law of averages, but there are structural reasons why this happens. And it's that the biggest constraint on an inefficient government is international competition. You can raise your taxes up to a certain point, then the money starts going abroad and you lose revenue. And so you're obliged to keep your taxes down, unless you have tax harmonization. Then you can export your costs and get around the problem. You can give your workforce incredibly generous entitlements and paternity leave and vacations and so on, up to a certain point. Then the factories start relocating and you lose the revenue. Unless you have the social chapter, and then you can export your costs to your rivals. And in a way, the story of the European Union over the last 40 years has been an attempt to preserve what they call the European social model, meaning a system that is relatively less efficient, by having a sufficiently large home market to enable them to withstand international competition. Now, that may have made sense in the 50s and 60s, when the population movements globally were relatively small, when capital movements globally were slow, and when most trade was regional. Okay? It may have made sense, in other words, when the competition was coming from Greece or from Portugal. It doesn't really make sense when the competition is coming from India or from China. And that's why the share of GDP occupied by the EU is in such calamitous decline. By the way, the same is not true of North America. Their share of world GDP has been pretty steady since the early 70s. This is a European problem rather than just a factor of Asia doing better. I think the independence is not it's not just a slogan. It's an approach to how to run a country and how to run an economy. And it implies competitiveness, it implies flexibility, diversity, variety, all the things that Europe used to have and that in the post-war period it's losing. Which brings me on to Johannes' question about is the EEA feasible? What's the best deal you could get? The EEA is, look, nothing is, perfection is not of this world, okay? But in terms of realistically what you could negotiate, the EEA has huge advantages over full EU membership. It means that you are part of the free market, part of the free movement of goods and services and people. But not the common agricultural policy, not the common fisheries policy. You control your own borders, you settle your own human rights issues. You make, in relative terms, a small contribution to the budget, nothing like as much as you would as full members. But here's the really important bit. You are not in the common external tariff. You're outside the EU's common commercial policy. You are free to negotiate trade deals with third countries outside the EU. And that is of incredible importance. It's a huge freedom. Why does that matter so much? Look, if the EU signs a trade accord with Japan, by and large, Iceland and the other EEA countries are offered the same deal. It doesn't make sense for the Japanese to sign one treaty with the EU and then negotiate a completely different one with Reykjavik. So they just say, okay, cross out EU and put Iceland, we'll do the same thing. But you have the option of going further if you feel that the EU has been unduly protectionist, which it often is. And so the EEA countries have, on a number of occasions, gone further with trade accords with Singapore, with Canada, with South Korea, which go beyond the level of liberalization that is acceptable to the EU. You don't find yourselves in the same position that we do, as a global country, as an exporting country, being dragged into a relatively protectionist position in order to defend the interest of some inefficient producer somewhere else in Europe. We had this huge trade dispute with China over textiles. We had another one with Vietnam over shoes. Why? Because somewhere in southern Europe is a hopeless company that needs protection. But why is that in the British national interest to be dragged in to that argument? We would love to have a deal where we could effectively opt into EU trade policy when it suited us, but go further when it didn't. So yes, I think the EEA or something like it will survive. And the great thing about it is it's not exclusive. You could perfectly well be a member of the EEA and also have a free trade deal with the United States. But we cannot be a member of the European Union and also have a free trade deal with the United States. That's the inherent superiority of your model.